Hello. This last Sunday, I participated in a club versus club match on board one, um, rated a little over 2150 against John Vaughn, who was rated a little over 2000, I think. This was a match between the Wachusett Chess Club and the Bill Ricca Chess Club, organized by Mike David. Thank you, Mike. I think this was a great idea. Um, and I had the white pieces. No, I didn't. I had the black pieces going into the first game. The way it's going to work is we'll play one more game against the same opponent, but we'll have the opposite color, and that'll take place next Sunday. So John opened with c4 against me, the dreaded English. So as usual, I did my best to transpose into a d-pawn opening with c6. He played d4, thank God. I played d5. And now we're into a Slav defense. Knight f3, knight f6, knight to c3. All theory so far, and I knew as much during the game. D takes c4. And here I expected a4 from John, which has been played a whole bunch of times. And its idea is to stop black from defending the pawn on c4 with b5. John played e3 instead, which I've heard referred to as a gambit, but might not be an actual gambit because I think white gets his pawn back. It's just that, at least according to the computer, things aren't amazing for him afterwards. So I played b5, and at this point was done with what I had for theoretical knowledge. But I had some memory of the fact that a computer told me that if white plays a4 here, black should play b4, chasing the knight, and so that's what happened in the game. John played knight a2. I think knight b1 and knight a2 are played about evenly. The risk of putting the knight on a2 is that it will get stuck there because it can't go to the c3 square or the b4 square. So unless it gains access to c1 at some point, it's going to be stuck where it is. I played e6. Again, I thought I remembered that the computer said this was the way to go with black in this variation. Turned out that was the case. Bishop takes c4, bishop e7, castle, castle. And I was, as I said, out of book here, but it turned out that we followed theory for a couple more moves. John played queen e2. I played bishop to b7. And the idea with this move is that I know white wants to play e4, and I want to be ready with the move c5. And having this bishop on b7 fits nicely with that because the bishop's attack on the e4 square will be revealed when I do that. Rook d1. And finally here, I deviated from what strong players have played in the past by playing queen c7. I think knight bd7 gets played here a lot. And then white plays bishop d2, putting pressure on b4. Black plays the natural a5, and white goes knight c1, rescuing his knight from the a2 square, probably intending to stick it onto b3, from which it looks at a5 and c5. I played queen c7 instead, and wasn't sure. I mean, I was thinking about knight bd7, but I wasn't sure which file I wanted my queen on. It seemed like white rooks were going to be on both the c and d files, which was making me nervous. But what I think I should have realized is that after white goes e4, e5, my knight will be sitting on an outpost on d5, and my queen being on that file can't cost me more than a pawn within reason, because the knight will be defended by the e6 pawn on that square. Whereas if I put the queen on the c file and then play c5 and end up with a knight on that square eventually, that knight won't be defended by a pawn, so a queen on the c file with a rook on c1 has the potential to cost me a piece. e4 from white. I expected John would go bishop to d2, and then after a5, actually I was expecting rook a to c1. But I don't see why he can't go with the plan that masters have used in the past, bringing the knight to c1 in order to get it back into the game. I responded to his e4 with c5, and now I am threatening the pawn on e4, and he has to do something about that. In addition, I am breaking down his center. So, you know, I think The computer says black is a little bit better here, and that's sort of what I remembered from having looked at that opening variation in the past. E5, not about this position, by the way. I didn't remember that about this position. I just remembered it about the variation involving white playing A4 and black playing B4, kicking the queenside knight. E5 from John, knight D5. So this knight is on a nice outpost now, and that kind of clarifies things. What it says, in effect, is that black is doing better on the queen side. This is a really nice outpost for black. All of black's pieces are on the queen side. And it says, in order to compensate for that, white probably has to make use of his pawn on e5 to launch some kind of kingside attack. And I was worried about the bishop coming back to d3, and there eventually being a Greek gift sacrifice with bishop takes h7, and then knight g5 check, and queen h5. But I thought I should be all right. You know, there should be some way to defend my position, because if a knight shows up on g5, I can always take it with the bishop that's sitting on e7. Bishop to d2 from John, a5, and now rook a to c1. And yeah, I think it's clear here that the queen would probably be better off on the d file behind the knight on d5, protected by the pawn on e6, than on the more open c file. But I played bishop to a6. Yeah, as I said earlier, I was worried about bishop d3 and a later sacrifice on h7, and my bishop was nice on b7, but I knew that I was kind of winning the battle on the queen side. So if I could eliminate his chances to attack me on the king side, then all that would be left is the queen side play. Bishop to a6 forces a trade of bishops because white cannot move the bishop back to b3 or he'll drop the queen on e2. And I guess wouldn't want to anyway, because that would probably invite c4 later. Queen e4 from John. He may be threatening to play bishop takes d5 and queen takes d5 here, though I'm not sure of that, because bishops should be pretty powerful with an exploding center like this. But I went ahead and traded on c4, and after rook takes c4, played knight d7. Knight b6 was also an option here, but again, I was worried about a kingside attack, and in particular about knight g5 threatening h7, and then if I play g6, he might play queen h4, and then if I play h5, he might play g4. I might get ripped open over there, so I thought I needed to include all of my pieces in the game to have the best chance I could. Knight d7, rook cc1. I was more worried about d takes c5, when I can't bring the knight to b6 because white can just take it, because the rook is now defended by the queen on e4. But I think I was planning during the game just to play knight takes c5, hitting the queen on e4, and claiming that these two knights are very powerful and that black has an advantage. He played rook cc1 instead, though. And I think I missed an opportunity here to go c4. c4 really enhances black's advantage on the queen side. And I thought about this during the game, but again was worried about a kingside attack that the computer says is no problem. But it's a computer and it can just calculate these things. Yeah, this obviously gives black an advantage on the queen side, but I might like to use the f8 square either for my queen or for the knight from d7 to help out with the defense of my king. So instead I played rook fc8, and that gave white time to play b3, and now black's advantage is not so big. Queen d8, h4. I went h6 here. Not sure it was necessary. I think I was playing a little bit scared on this side of the board, and I have been very critical of students in the past for moving pawns on the side of the board on which the opponent is attacking. So maybe I should be criticized for this one. And John played g4, which is definitely in the spirit of the position. It hangs the pawn on h4, but white has to attack on the king side or black's going to win on the queen side. And of course, the computer says just take the pawn on h4. But I was worried about knight h4, queen h4, king g2, intending rook h1. Computer sees no problem with that. C takes d4, rook h1, And, you know, just play f5 and everything is great. Ridiculous. E takes f6. Yeah, the queen takes back, and now black is defending everything the correct number of times. Oh, and don't worry about g5. H takes g5, because this check is nothing. This queen h7 check is absolutely nothing. I don't know. It's very difficult for me to calculate things like this, so I'm not super disappointed that I didn't find I could take the pawn. Instead, I played c takes d4. Yeah, and I really thought John was going to press forward here with g5 and a kingside attack. Again, just like with g4, with the idea being that it might not be computer approved, but it's what white has to do to stay in the game. And I was planning g6 to block up the light squares. I have no more light squared bishop, but I have a dark squared bishop, so it's easier for me to defend on the dark squares. And I thought he'd take, and then I'd develop my piece and try to hold on the king side from here and win on the queen side. But John played knight takes d4 instead. I went knight c5, queen f3, and only now took the pawn on h4. Things are a little bit more clarified on the queen side. I have two really nice knights on the C and D files. I think I can get away with it now. There's also no knight on f3 to capture the bishop, so king g2 and rook h1 isn't quite as effective. Knight b5 from John. I thought more critical here was knight f5. And let's see, what's white threatening? Maybe just to grab this bishop and do the same thing, king g2, rook h1, or maybe some kind of sacrifice on h6. And my idea was, if black takes it, there's this interesting move, bishop e3, which creates two double attacks. So white's down a piece for now, but I think he's getting something back. John played knight to b5 instead. I played bishop e7. Right around here, I was getting very low on time relative to John, and was pretty worried that if I didn't save some time, I would just end up blundering in a complicated late middle game or early end game. So I started making moves more quickly, and it starts to show in the computer evaluation of those moves. He played bishop to f4. I played queen f8. There was a pin on the d file, so that doesn't exist anymore, and now I can think about knight takes f4, which in this case would win material because I could follow up with bishop to g5. Bishop to g3, bishop g5. White can't play f4 right now, so I thought, why not make the rook on c1 uncomfortable? John went rook c4. And yeah, here's where things really start to go wrong for black. I kind of lost the thread. I played knight to b7, just trying to keep his knight out of d6, but with a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, because I knew that, in general, when you've got an open-ish position like this, you don't want your knights going backwards. King g2 from John, and rook c5, queen e4, rook a to c8. I like that John's queen returned to e4 now that my knight can't use the c5 square, and it preps the move f4, which will kick the bishop away. f4, bishop e7, bishop f2. It's pretty clear at this point that the initiative has kind of shifted, and it's now black who's being pushed backwards. Okay, again, the computer finds a nice answer here and says black is still winning. Rook takes c4, b takes c4, knight to c5. And now the computer wants to move the queen and play knight b6. But what I was looking at in the game is just bishop takes c5, followed by a capture on d5. But the computer sees compensation in the form of an attack on the white king along the second rank. So, yeah, I would have trouble enough finding that kind of thing if I weren't short on time. So I played rook 5 to c6, missing knight a7. But luckily I had knight c5, and after he moved his queen, rook 6 to c7, and after a trade on c8, at first I thought black was still much better here, and that turns out to be the case. But then I saw rook d to c1, and became concerned. And that's because if I move this knight out of the way, there's going to be at least one capture on c7. And that's going to displace one of my knights. And I'm going to end up with a queen on c8 with a knight pinned to it on c7. Which doesn't look like compensation for the pawn of material I'm down. I need my knights to stay active. But if I leave the knight on c5, then there might later be queen d1 to g1, as an example, to put more pressure on it, and then he's attacking it 4 times, I'm defending it 3 times, and I'm going to have to move it. So this was a little bit worrying. Then I spotted knight to d3, and thought, oh, everything might work out for me, because if he plays queen takes d3, there's knight takes f4 check, winning the queen. But this fails for several reasons, one of which I spotted during analysis, which is the very simple rook takes f4, rook c1, knight c1, queen c1, and then, for example, rook c4, when white is up a rook. The computer says big advantage for black still after rook d to c1, though I don't remember why. I don't normally rely on computers during my analysis, but this was a particularly complicated game, so I think it's worth it just to avoid being wrong about every single thing I said. John played knight c1 instead. I played knight to c3, and he went rook d6. An interesting idea, because if I take that rook, then after e takes d6, if I go rook c6 to try to keep defending the knight, then there's going to be d7. And if the knight takes, I'm dropping material on c6. And if the queen takes, I'm dropping material on c5. Am I? Maybe not. Anyway, that's what I thought during the game. So I didn't take the rook immediately. And after bishop takes d6, e takes d6, if I go rook to d7 immediately, I drop the knight on c5. I went knight 5 to e4 instead, which I didn't spot until after he played rook d6, because the rook is not on d1 anymore, which means it's not defending the knight on c1, although maybe that would allow me to try this way of playing anyway, because I have 2 attackers on the c file. But I thought here that if rook takes e4, knight takes e4, queen takes e4, I'm going rook takes c1. I've recovered my exchange, and I have a much stronger attack than white does. John instead played rook c to d4, but now I thought I could get away with bishop takes d6, so I played that, and after e takes d6, I played rook d7. Knight e2 from John. He was really starting to burn time at this point as well, and was sort of catching up to me on the clock, but I still had significantly less time. f5, protecting the outpost on e4, bishop to e1, hitting that knight, and rook takes d6. Okay, so if white doesn't have something here, some tactical win of material, then black is up 2 pawns and should win this game. John tried rook c4, but that invites queen to d7, and now I'm looking at bringing the rook down to d3, which is bad news for the white queen and probably indirectly the white king. Knight takes c3 from John, but this allows rook d3 immediately, and afterwards John resigned. He has to either sack his queen, which shouldn't work out very well for him with an exposed king, or he has to move his queen out of the way, and then I'm just going to take back on c3, and he has no counterplay. Instead, maybe it was worth it to try bishop takes c3, because after rook d3, there's this interesting move, rook d4. Anyway, I played rook d3 after knight takes c3, and John resigned. So, I won on board 1. Roger Capello won on board 2. Mike Comiso won on board 4. I think our team lost 2 games, and we drew 2, so we came out ahead this week by a point. We've got one more game next Sunday, and scoring 3.5 out of 7 will be enough to win the match. So I hope we can do that. We are underrated on average by 50 points per board, so it would be a nice victory if we could pull it off. All right, I'll be back next week with my game with white against John. Thank you for watching.